So take a little look at this note marker. We're not going to focus too much on what the extract says here. We're just going to try and use our knowledge of ADAS diagrams, really. So we've been told with the help of a suitable diagram and like 95 times out of 100 in macro, they might as well just put with an ADAS diagram. Explain how a rise in inward foreign direct investment may lead to increased exports. So that might sound like very problematic for you guys at this stage because you might be like, I don't really know what foreign direct investment is. How am I supposed to link this to exports? Really, you shouldn't think of foreign direct investment as different from domestic investment. So when you have I in the AD equation, you shouldn't think there's a particular difference between sort of foreign investment I and domestic investment I, at least in terms of the effect on the economy. The only thing that's really different is just the source of the initial capital. Foreign direct investment means the initial capital for the investment comes from outside the country, or the funds for the investment come from outside the country. Whereas obviously domestic investment just means some internal capitalist has acquired new capital. So foreign direct investment, just think of it in terms of like how it will affect the economy as being very, very similar to regular investment, which means there's two ways you could actually talk about it in terms of ADAS shifts. Answers in the chat. How does investment affect ADAS? There's one obvious one not so obvious one. So really nice and quick today. We've got a small group and some of the usual stalwarts of the chat are not here. So I'm trusting you guys. Answers really nice and quick. How might investment affect shifts in, or how might investment cause shifts in either AD or AS? Whether it's okay, Debian, very nice because he's got a less obvious one, shift aggregate supply out. So hopefully someone will put the more obvious one in whilst I explain why shift aggregate supply out, although Mira has actually given me a perfect explanation of that. Although maybe not perfect, but so Mira said investment in technology leads to productivity increase, so aggregate supply increases. I absolutely agree with that. So that could be really good explanation here. So if foreign firms invest in technology, new technology, productivity increases, that then decreases costs, which increases aggregate supply. And if you're sharp, that should lead you on to the answer to this question. But what if it's not investment in technology? What if it's just investment in capital or new capital? Maybe some capital that isn't technologically advanced, like I don't know, screwdrivers, tool racks. You know, what if it's foreign direct investment in very simple manufacturing industry rather than technology? So it's interesting. How might we tackle that? And why has no one given me the obvious shift yet? We're all talking about aggregate supply. What's the obvious impact of investment on aggregate demand and aggregate supply? I didn't think it was aggregate supply. I thought how investment changes aggregate supply was the less obvious of the two. Anybody, or is it going to be the usual carriers? I'll give it, I'll give it 10, 15 seconds and then I'll jump in. Thank you, Devian. Yes, it is going to be the usual carriers. AD goes out. So, of course, that would be the AD equation, right? We've got aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So let me do a bit of annotations to help you guys keep up if necessary. So we've got our investment. Oh, God, I need to move boxes around. 1 second. We've got our investment, and there's two ways we can talk about this. Either is increasing AD, shifting aggregate demand out, or increasing aggregate supply. So the aggregate demand one, very, very easy to explain because investment is just part of the aggregate demand equation. And I think Mira has just given me a explanation of what we were talking about previously, which is why would investment increase aggregate supply? even if it's not into technology, even if it's just into basic capital, which is what investment strictly means, right? Is investment into any kind of capital, not necessarily better technology. So Mira has said investment will lead to AD increasing. Investment in capital means there's a trade-off in labor, so unemployment increases potentially. Potentially, that what Mira said could be a good counter argument because she's effectively saying if more capital is employed, then less labor could be employed, which could reduce income for consumers, and that could lead to AD decreasing. So that could provide a very interesting evaluation for this point that AD increases. Although what I'm really looking for is a very simple explanation of why does aggregate supply increase if there is more capital in the economy. I'm going to try to give you guys some clues because I do think like ultimately the best way of learning something is to come to the realization partly by yourself rather than just have someone tell you, oh, this is how it works. So I'll try to give you some clues, and if that doesn't work, then I will just tell you how it works. So think about investment means firms buy more capital. If there is more capital, what happens to the supply of capital? What happens to the price of capital? And why would that relate to aggregate supply in the economy as a whole? So one more time, investment means more capital. Firms buy more capital. There is going to be more capital in the economy. Again, that could just be screwdrivers, spanners, toolboxes. What happens to the supply of capital? How does that relate to aggregate supply in the economy as a whole? So yes, right. There'll be higher supply of capital. So guys, think it through. More investment, higher supply of capital. What will happen to the price of capital in the factor market for capital? Niati, yes, right. We're all chipping in now. Price of capital decrease. Excellent. So if the price of capital decreases, why is that relevant to aggregate supply? Why on earth does that affect aggregate supply if the price of capital decreases? What has this got to do with aggregate supply? Because I thought capital is like a micro market. The price of capital decreases. Are we not doing micro here? Niati again, Krishna, well done. Yes, cost of production for firms across the economy should decrease. So if capital generally gets cheaper because there's more capital, then production generally gets cheaper across the economy, which is why aggregate supply increases. So it's interesting because Mira's initial explanation of technology is probably where most students instinctively go, to be honest. And as long as you're specific, I don't see any reason an examiner is going to mark you down for that. If you said that, say, for example, if FDI is in new technology, that will increase productivity, and then the increased productivity lowers costs, and then that increases aggregate supply. Again, I don't see any reason an examiner was going to criticize that at A-level standard, but hopefully you can see what I mean, that investment is broader than just new technology. So if we really want to understand it, we need to think about this broad definition of investment as just more capital. Why does more capital mean more aggregate supply in the economy? So I think the lovely thing about that as well is because capital is a factor of production, more capital also just means more LRAS. Because if you have more goods that produce other goods, your maximum capacity of production, your maximum capacity of supply will increase. So okay, now that's very interesting, right? Because if we know our AD/AS mechanics very well, which of course we do collectively, we've got two possible options here. And what we need to do is work out which one of these is going to help lead to increased exports. And again, I think this is very, very interesting. That's why I picked this particular question. So I would like some ideas in the chat. What you need to think about is how will the factors that affect export demand be impacted by these shifts of AS and AD? To answer that, of course, you need to think, what are the factors that affect demand for exports? So I'll give it again like 30 seconds, maybe see if anyone goes for it. And so question essentially is which of these is going to help increase exports? Devian has asked, people abroad are purchasing assets from our country. If that's a question on what we mean by exports, we need to think about the difference between exports and assets. So exports, goods and services, right? And FDI would be the purchase of assets. So if so Devian might be asking here, is FDI and exports like the same thing or distinct? Does FDI directly increase exports? No, and that is the challenge. So FDI does mean foreign capitalists are either starting or buying companies' assets, basically capital assets, starting or buying companies in the UK. So this purchase is of assets, not of exports. So the initial FDI does not count as exports. So it's not that simple for us. We definitely need to think about how the FDI indirectly affects exports. Again, be very interested to see if anyone can kind of follow through here. If the answers, like if you were to say which lesson we've had contains the answers, it would be my lessons on ADAS and how that relates to macro objectives like trade, growth, employment. So I'll give it just a little bit longer, let you guys stew on it. Then I'll step in, as must sometimes be the case. So this is obviously critical. There's a 9 marker, so you probably don't have time to cover both. You don't want 2 diagrams in the 9 marker. In the majority of cases, just going to cost you time. So we've got to make a decision here. And that's I'm putting you guys in that spot, right? If this is your exam, which are you going to go for? Right, Krishna, I'm not going to give it away. Krishna's getting the marks. Well done, Krishna. Again, the rest of you, you're in the exam. You've got this decision. Clocks are ticking. What are you going for? Yeah, maybe he's gone adventurous, he's gone ambitious. Niati, I think so, but hasn't specified which route you are going for. Are you going for increasing area supply, increasing area demand? That's the key question here, is what we're going to show in the diagram. Devian, yes, again, although so far I feel like Christian's the only one who's given me a straight up. If this curve increases, that's our question, right? Is it an increase in supply or an increase in demand that increases exports? Krishna so far is the only one who said it's an increase in this one because it does this, which increases exports. So far he's the only one I'm saying, getting the marks for the analysis here. But all right, no one else. The usual crowd. Okay, all right. Let me fill in the gaps then. So it is going to be this one. I think this is going to be a lot more useful. Be interesting to see the mark scheme, but effectively, if you draw this out, which I'm not going to save time, I'm going to assume you know this. You should know this by now. If AS increases, shifts outward, macroeconomic equilibrium price level decreases, and this will basically increase the competitiveness of UK exports. Like, think about what we say on a macro scale when the price level decreases. We're kind of meaning the general price level of all goods or most goods in the economy is going down. So of course that includes UK exports. UK exports are goods from the UK economy, so these are getting cheaper. So that means increased demand for exports. Now, the reason I'd be interested to see the mark schema is because, especially with macro, there's probably other ways to approach this. An easy substitute would be to use LRS instead of AS, although that won't change sort of the next steps here. you could potentially link growth to exports if growth creates government funds for increased education and whatnot, then that could be used to talk about selling more exports, especially in things like financial services where skilled workers are really crucial. But that's I think my point here is not that there's only one way of doing it, but this to me just seems the simplest, most direct way of doing it. And again, it goes back to my first lessons on AD because I sort of taught you guys. I know this is a really weird angle, but whatever. What are you going to do? So I taught you guys that one of the most important things you want to be able to do with these diagrams is link changes to all of the objectives. So it's very, very easy once you get the hang of it. Just as a reminder of how you need to think about it, changes on the x-axis indicate changes in employment and growth. So what's happening on the x-axis can link really nicely to the objectives of employment and growth. What's happening on the y-axis can link really nicely to the objectives of inflation and trade. Trade, of course, includes basically demand for imports and demand for exports. So that's all I'm doing here. I'm just using this very, very simple idea of shifts in aggregate supply or aggregate demand cause changes in the price level. That tells me what happens to trade and inflation, and changes in income. That tells me what happens to growth and employment. And for bonus points, you can also get some information on trade from the x-axis as well. But that's the essential idea here. So the AD route, can anyone spot why that might actually be counterproductive? And if we made this choice wrong, we might kind of write ourselves into a bit of a problem. Can anybody spot why that would be AD increasing? It relates to what we've just covered about AS increasing, of course. Dealers ask, can you say it leads to a shift in LRAS? Yep, absolutely. Again, if I just changed this to LRAS, it doesn't change the next steps. The shift in LRAS still decreases the price level. It's just a long run macro equilibrium instead of a short run macro equilibrium. Excellent, Mira. So Mira has spotted that the problem with this route, and again, if you weren't thinking it through clearly or you didn't know your AS/AD mechanics very well and how to sort of use this strategy well, you might end up thinking, oh, exports AD, let's write AD, and then you go into AD rises if there's more investment, and then you realize, oh wait, that makes prices higher. So now exports are less attractive, which is literally the opposite of what we wanted. So it sort of shows, I think this question very, very nicely shows quite a few things. Firstly, the primacy of ADAS questions for these 9 markers in the macro paper. It's like basically guaranteed. It's guaranteed at least one of the 9 markers, or as close to guaranteed as a thing can possibly be, that at least one and probably both of the 9 markers will be ADAS. It also shows that it's very, very important sort of at a more advanced level for some of the more tricky questions to be really, really familiar with these, what causes shifts and which factors shift to things. That's the very interesting thing here. If you didn't know that investment can have AD impacts and aggregate supply impacts, and you only knew it could have aggregate demand impacts, which, as I've said, is the most obvious, the most common knowledge. This is less common by far, I would say. Then you've got a big problem, right, potentially. So it's very, very useful for sort of demonstrating the importance of knowing the factors that cause shifts like the back of your hand, and also for the usefulness of this strategy I introduced with ADAS diagrams, that the answer to a lot of questions that relate to macroeconomic objectives like exports, imports, growth, employment, inflation can very simply be approached by thinking about shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, any final questions on this or thoughts or notes before I move on? We won't be covering the essay here because that's sort of best done if you've been through like all the pros and cons of FDI. But I'm sure if you guys think about it, like just based on what we've done using ADAS diagrams, you could probably get a couple of points in for the essay as well. All right, any final questions, stick in the chat. I'll give it like 30 seconds or so, and then we'll press on. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about these online classes is it's all I have to know how well you guys are doing is what I see in the chat, right? Because I don't have the interaction we would have in a face-to-face class. I can't pick on you guys as easy as I could. So by the what is in the chat, I do feel like you guys are up to date on a lot of the basics and needing me to point out only the more complex stuff. However, that might be a factor of the kind of people who are putting answers into the chat, right? So is one of the reasons I'm trying to read them out and sort of talk about what is in the chat a lot, is because if you aren't putting answers in the chat, I think that's going to help you realize where your level is, whether you know the basics or not. So Mira has asked, what would some evaluations be? Um, if 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 we were just talking about whether a rise in foreign direct investment leads to increased export, I might talk about it. It depends whether the investment is in new companies, like new capital, new firms being created, or whether it's really just a foreign owner buying existing capital, in which case the effects in terms of the supply of capital increasing are obviously much less. So that's a very common evaluation for FDI and one that applies quite well to this scenario. Um, I think you could evaluate if you only did one of these shifts as well. You could evaluate. I mean, yeah, you could evaluate using the other. You could say that the price decrease from aggregate supply increasing would be effectively cancelled out by the price increasing from aggregate demand increasing. Or you could phrase that in terms of it depends whether the aggregate demand or aggregate supply effects are larger, which is interesting. But okay, let's move on then if there are no other questions. So let me clear all this drawing mess and let's have a look at this extract. I love this. Nice one, AQA. Good stuff, very helpful. So anyway, we have what clearly looks like an inflation question. Firstly, because it's about Argentina, which, if you know anything about the Argentinian economy, immediately says, "Ooh, inflation question," and we've literally got an extract with inflation in the title. So I think this 9 marker again, very useful to look at in terms of ADAS mechanics, and we might have a very quick discussion of the 25 marker as well. So with the help of a diagram, explain how a reduction in tariffs could help to reduce inflation. Reduce inflation. What diagram are we looking at, guys? What diagram are we always looking at for macro by and large? Of course, it is aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So just to cut a long story short here, because this is in many ways very similar to the previous question. If it's reducing inflation, that has to be either an increase in aggregate supply. Let me annotate this. Has to be increase in aggregate supply or decrease in aggregate demand. So again, if you think about it, we've kind of got two options here: increase aggregate supply or decrease aggregate demand. And we have been asked, how will a reduction in tariffs reduce inflation? So it's how will a reduction in tariffs increase aggregate supply or decrease aggregate demand? So it might be that one of these is logical. It might be that both of them are possibly logical. But again, you've got to make your choice. You've got to pick that road, stick with it. I know you guys haven't done tariffs fully yet, but again, I don't really think that's essential. It's more ASAD mechanics. I think you should know from our previous lessons that tariffs are a tax on imports, and I think, to be fair, you should know from previous lessons with me exactly how taxing on imports could relate to AS and AD. In fact, I think I literally said the exact analysis chain, like the chain links you potentially need here. So, answers in the chat again. Make your choices. Question: are you gonna follow it up with 2 out of 2? Anyone else gonna impress me with the precision of their response? I'm not necessarily looking for complexity, guys. That's always nice to remember, right? I often prefer precise simplicity than obscure complexity. But anywho, reduction in tariffs. I mean, if it helps, it will affect both curves. There's definitely an argument that it will affect both curves, but the key is which way, right? BAD up, AD down, down, up, down. Okay, Devian first. Early bird gets the worm. He says cost of production falls as there's a reduction in tariffs. So, yep, that basically leads to lower prices. Devian would be getting the marks, although, can anyone fill in a little gap? Why does the cost of production? If there's a reduction in tariffs, why would the cost of production for firms in Argentina fall? It does, it is correct. So hopefully Devian's answer has clued the rest of you in to the fact that we want this road. I think here, reduction in tariffs could reduce costs of production, which will increase aggregate supply, which will help to reduce inflation. So Devian's answered my question by saying tax is a cost of production. However, it's not domestic producers. It's not a tax on domestic production. So an aggregate supply represents the cost for domestic producers, not foreign producers. So it would actually, and this is very, very important for the rest of you, as well as Devian, it would be incorrect to say that the tariff directly increases the cost of domestic producers. I think Dia has got it. Yes, Devian, second by the cherry, got it. Perfect. So it's really about the cost of raw materials or capital for producers who are importing their facts of production, right? Some producers, quite a lot in the globalized economy, are going to be importing facts of production. So let's say, and this is my classic example, a UK car company imports steel from China. There are tariffs, there are taxes on Chinese steel producers who sell in the UK. So they put the price up for the UK car company because they've got to pay the UK government these import taxes. If the UK government reduces the import taxes on the Chinese car company, then that company can lower the steel price. Sorry, on the Chinese steel company, then the steel company can lower the price for the UK company, and then the UK buyer has lower costs. So effectively, I think I've actually made that more complicated than it needs to be. If you reduce tariffs, you're going to reduce the cost of imports. And remember, firms get imports too. That's all this is. Reduction in tariff reduces the cost of imports, and firms buy imports of factors of production. So I think that's, again, the easiest route to get there here. And well done, Dia, Nyati, and Devian on that. So can we think about AD next then? So I've said AD does shift. The reduction in tariffs will have an impact on AD. Is it going to be up, down? It's an important question, I think, for you guys, even though we have a possible way to answer this, because it would still be good to work out, are there two possible ways to answer this, or is the AD option not relevant? So if you reduce tariffs, how would that impact AD? And just in case it's not clear, answers in the chat. That's why I'm not saying anything. How will the reduction in tariffs impact AD? Good. Niati says, ooh, wait a second. Wait a second. Mira has started her answer with, I don't know if this is correct, but we shall see. Let me wait for a few more to come in. Oh, we've got all sorts of things here. So Niati has said increased AD as imports are cheaper. Um, it's not 100% not the case. You can actually argue that. That would almost be the evaluation though. So I'll come back to that in a second, Niati. But you can make that argument. Mira has said reduced tariffs means government gains less from tax revenue. Correct. So government spending decreases, AD decreases. Possible, but not guaranteed, right? Governments can spend through borrowing. So just because they have less tax doesn't mean they have to spend less. Devin said AD would rise, so similar to Niati, but no explanation given. Harsh AD would increase as it would decrease price of imports. So that's effectively what Niati's gone for. So here's my question to you guys. If you decrease, and very quick answer in the chat, please. If you decrease the price of imports, what should happen to demand for imports? That's correct. Decrease price of imports. That part is correct. Reduce tariffs, decrease price of imports. Good, Krishna, good Mira, increase, right? So reduced price of imports equals more demand for imports. How does that then relate to AD? Tariffs, cheaper imports, more demand for imports. How does that relate to AD? In the domestic economy, I should say. So you reduce tariffs, imports into your country become cheaper, people buy more imports. What happens to AD? I know a lot of you have gone for increase, but I feel like we are getting the idea now. AD would fall, right? Because M is a negative component of AD. So if there's more imports, M may increase, and that means AD would fall. So a lot of you guys, your initial response did correctly spot that imports are going to get cheaper. But then why exactly you link that to AD increasing, I'm not sure. Typically, we would say that imports getting cheaper is going to mean more demand for imports, is going to mean higher M. And again, because it's a negative component of AD would then fall. So I think that would again be the typical sort of easy basic understanding, and that's perfect because that would mean this option is open to us as well. In fact, we could go either road here to help reduce inflation. We could say tariffs will reduce the cost of imported raw materials, or reducing tariffs will do that, which will decrease overall production costs, which will shift our aggregate supply. Or we could say reducing tariffs will make imports cheaper, which means M will increase, which will bring AD down. So, like I said, though, for Niati's initial comment, you can make the argument that, and let me annotate this because this is going to get quite hectic. So we have said decrease price of imports equals increased demand to demanded of imports equals increased value of imports equals decreased AD. Okay. So what a lot of you originally argued is actually the evaluation to this typical case, because this typical case assumes PED is greater than 1. So if you break this assumption, you can actually end up with the opposite conclusion, which is why it's a great evaluation. So I'm going to try and explain this briefly. Like I said, I wanted to use today to introduce you guys to some new stuff anyway, without making a lesson entirely on advanced macro. But let's imagine the PED is very, very inelastic. Then there might be a very large decrease in price of the imports and a very small response in quantity demanded, which I've just done by the size of the arrows. And if that is the case, what you can think about is the total spending on imports, which is what M is. Because remember, M is the value, not the volume. Quantity demanded is the volume, but M itself is the value of imports, which is really the price multiplied by the volume. So what we can think is if the price of imports into the UK decreases massively, so basically they get a lot cheaper, but barely anyone buys more. Let's imagine like only one extra person, just to make it really extreme. There's like a 90% drop in the price of imports, and only one extra person buys more imports. Then obviously that means the total value we spend on imports is going to go down because we'll spend a lot less through the big decrease in price, and we won't be spending much more because only one extra guy is actually buying more imports. So in this case, the total value of M would decrease, in which case AD would increase. So that's a really beautiful and useful advanced sort of analysis eval chain for whether the price of imports or exports, you could do this for exports as well, whether the price of imports changing does affect AD in the expected way. But what I would stress to all of you who initially answered with this second chain, that cheaper imports means more AD, is again that this is the kind of atypical assumption. Like this is the typical stance. And the reason for that is because we're kind of assuming that in the long run, demand for most things becomes elastic. So this is the typical stance. And this is more like the evaluation where you say, okay, but what if PD is actually inelastic? Questions on that specific idea, put them in the chat. Otherwise, I think we'll move on. But bottom line here, both of these routes are viable. Absolutely. Which makes this, I think, a little bit easier than the last question. But yeah, like I said, any final question in the chat? Otherwise, we'll move on. So Mira said, can you please briefly explain the eval? I'll explain it in a slightly different way using a slightly different method, and then I'll move on. So I want to look at one or two more questions, and obviously it'll be on YouTube, this alternative explanation. So, spoke too soon. All right, it's coming up on the left. So let's imagine we've got two cases. Elastic demand for imports and inelastic demand for imports. Now, like I said, usually we assume this is the case. And that means if imports get cheaper, let's say P1 to P2, which is what we've been talking about here, a reduction in tariffs. And the way you would fully model that, although I possibly shouldn't get ahead of myself, but the way you would fully model this situation is that a reduction in tariffs is going to do this, shift supply outwards, and that's going to decrease the equilibrium price of imports, which is going to cause an extension of demand. But for simplicity, we are just going to look at the extension of demand. So imports get cheaper, demand for imports extends from Q1 to Q2. Now, what does this mean for M, the value of spending on imports? Because remember, volume on the x-axis here is not value. So we cannot say M has gone up just because the quantity of imports has gone up. The value can be thought of as the total amount spent on imports. So if this is the demand for all imports in the UK and the price is like £10 and we're buying 5 units, I know that's really small, but just hear me out. Theoretically, if we buy 5 imports for £10 each, then the total value of our spending on imports in the economy would be 50, right? Did I remember the right numbers? But anyway, hopefully. So it's very simple in practice, actually. the M value in the AD equation is very similar to the total revenue or total spending concept in a micro diagram. And in this case, because the price of imports falls only a little bit and the demand for imports increases a lot, then the total value spent on imports is much bigger. You can just see that this second box I'm very badly drawing is much bigger than the first box here that I very badly drew. Now, if you do the same thing for inelastic demand, notice the opposite happens. So if the imports go down in price a lot, then consumers in the UK don't respond much. They don't buy much more. I don't know if you guys can still see this, but yeah, they don't buy much more. And that means we are going to go from this much total spending on imports to this much total spending on imports. So in this case, M decreases, whereas in this case, M increases. And again, I know it's a fast pace here, but hopefully with YouTube and reviewing like your elasticity rules, it should make a lot of sense. The sort of the way you can kind of really see this is just, in this case, the second box of total spending on imports is less, sorry, than the first, which means your total import spending has decreased, whereas in this box, sorry, in this diagram, the total spending on imports P2Q2 has increased compared to the initial level of spending. So hopefully again that makes it a bit clearer. And like I said, if not, review it, have a look at the elasticity rules, because that's what this really comes down to. Yes, yeah. So Mira said essentially like value of imports is just total revenue. Effectively, yes. Like you can think of it in exactly the same way. It's the total revenue or total spending. So if you total value of imports is the total revenue made by foreign producers, it's also the total spending on imports by domestic consumers. Those two things will be exactly the same, right? If we spend £100 on imports, foreign firms will earn £100 through imports. So yeah, it's kind of total revenue, but from the consumer's perspective.